Hi everyone, it's Michelle here. Welcome back to Grounded Haven Homestead. Today's a really exciting day because it officially starts off the beginning of the 2022 season because we're going to be starting the very first seeds of the year today. I know this seems kind of early. It's the middle of January, but this is the right time to be starting certain kinds of seeds. You don't want to be starting everything right now. Like for us, it's way too early to be starting peppers and tomatoes, but there are a few things that we can start right now and it's just the perfect time for them. And it's going to feel really good to get our hands in some soil again and to get a start on the gardening year. I'm definitely ready for it. So let me go over really quickly the things that I'm going to be starting from seed today. The main thing really that I'm starting are onions, and I have plenty of them this year. Last year I grew onions for the first time and I only grew one variety, but this year I have 4 varieties of onions, some leeks, and also some shallots. So I'm going to be starting plenty of these. So I'll go over the varieties really quickly. First I have Cabernet red onions from Johnny's. Then I have a long red onion. This packet is from Baker Creek. And then I have like standard cooking yellow varieties. The first one is called Australian Brown. And then I have Cortland onions. These are leftover from last year, so I don't have a full packet. But these are the ones that we grew last year that did really well, so I'm going to finish those seeds off. Then I have a couple of packets of King Richard leeks from Johnny's. And then lastly, I have some shallots. So we're going to be growing a ton of these, and the great thing about onions is they don't take a lot of space. You can start hundreds, like literally hundreds or thousands of onions in less than an entire seed starting tray. And even though you start them really early, they're super low maintenance. So yeah, I'm really excited to start lots of new varieties this year. Another thing that's really good to grow this time of year are herbs that take a long time. So I have a couple here that I'm growing. The first one is going to be thyme. But this is also a good time to be starting things like rosemary, sage, lavender. It's a little early for more tender herbs like parsley or basil, so I'm going to wait on those. And then the other kind of herb that I'm growing is lemongrass, which I grew last year and I really loved it. So we're going to be doing that again this year. And the last thing I'm going to be growing is celery. Again, I grew this for the first time last year and it did pretty well for us in the spring, so I'm going to be doing that again. Celery takes a really long time to get going, so these seeds are going to stay pretty small for a while, and now is a good time to start them. Just for some context, to figure out when you should be starting your seeds, it's mid-January for us, and I know that that's a good time to be starting these things, but for you that might be a little bit different. For reference, our estimated last frost date is in the middle of April, so if yours is later, you might want to wait a little bit to start these things. And just for example, here's the back of one of my packets of onions, and here it says to start it 8 to 12 weeks in advance of planting it out, but you plant it out before your last frost, like 3 to 4 weeks, about a month before your estimated last frost date. So for us, since our estimated last frost date is in mid-April, we're going to be transplanting these out hopefully in mid-March. And then if we count back 2 or 3 months from then, that's right now. And then again for celery, this one I made a note that it has to be started 10 to 12 weeks before our last frost date, but celery is a little bit cold hardy as well, so that can also go out a little bit before your last frost date. So yeah, just count backwards from your estimated last frost date depending on when these things should be sown for you. So let's get started planting all of these things in some seed trays. Before I get my hands dirty with any soil, I always like to start off by labeling all of my plant tags. This makes it a lot easier later on so that I'm not trying to deal with these things when my hands are dirty with soil. And it also helps for me to be able to plan out how many of every kind of pot I need, because I can stick these tags in here and then I can see how many of each variety I have space to grow, and if I need to go out and get some more pots to wash out, I can do all of that ahead of time before I get started. So I have a couple of 2-inch pots here, which I'm going to be using for all of the onion starts, and then also a couple for the lemongrass. And then I have some 4 packs. These are going to be for the thyme and the celery. For most of these onions, I'm going to be doing 2 pots per variety, which doesn't seem like a lot, but you can really pack a lot of onion seeds into a tiny little pot like this and they do perfectly fine. So I'll show you that later on. But for now, I'm just gonna get started filling these all up with some soil. I'm using potting soil instead of seed starting mix, but I did kind of like sift out any larger pieces to make sure the seeds would be able to grow okay. My pots are all nicely filled, so let's get to planting. I'm gonna start with the onions first. And for these, I'm going to be planting them very densely. These seeds have a coating, so that's why they look like that, but usually they're black, which you'll see later. So I'm just gonna go into the pot and very liberally sprinkle this onto the surface, covering almost the entire surface of soil with seeds. Here's what that looks like. This is probably about 60 or 70 seeds in there, and that's going to be my goal for each of these pots. So here is another variety, and they don't have the coating, so they're just black. And again, I'm just going to sprinkle liberally. You probably can't see these ones as well since they're black, but here's what that looks like. The reason you can seed onion seeds so densely is because they really don't take a lot of space when they're growing. They're just going to be these scrawny little sprouts that basically just grow vertically. They'll kind of look like chives, and we're going to be able to keep them in these pots densely planted until they're ready to transplant out. You never have to pot them up. The way their roots grow, they don't really tangle with each other, so when you go to plant them out and you have to separate like 50 plants from this one pot, it's not an issue at all. Last year when I did it, I was really surprised just how easy it was to separate those plants, and they did really well once they were transplanted out. So I'm not counting how many seeds I put in here, but I'd say it's anywhere between 50 to 75 seeds per each of these pots. And I'm gonna do all of them now and then cover them up with soil in a little bit. Most of these varieties are new to me. The only ones that I've grown before are the Cortland onions, which are the main onion I grew last year. And then I've also grown the leeks, which also did well for us. So all the other varieties are new, and I'm really excited to see how they do. It's really fun to be able to grow onions from seed because you get so many more options in terms of variety. If you buy onion starts like from a big box store, a lot of times they don't even tell you what kind of onion they are. Maybe it'll just say like yellow onion or red onion. And even if it does say the variety, you only have like one choice anyway. And who knows if it's even the best onion for your area, because in order to bulb up properly, you have to grow the right kind of onion that's adapted to your latitude, because that affects your day length, and certain onions need certain amount of daylight hours in order to bulb up. Generally speaking, if you're like more in the south, you'll need short day onions, and then if you're in the north, you'll need long day onions. We're kind of like in the mid-south. We're in central Virginia, and intermediate day onions do pretty well for us. So I'm finished seeding all of these now. I'm just gonna lightly cover them up with soil. Another thing to keep in mind with onion seeds is that they tend to lower in germination rate the older they get, like more so than other seeds. So that's just something to be aware of when you're purchasing. Honestly, I probably purchased too many varieties this year. I probably could have gotten away with just a few instead of getting all of these, because I'm going to have some seeds that I'm not going to be able to grow this year. I'm just going to try to use them up at least in the next 2 years to make sure I still get a good germination rate. But if you do have older onion seeds, you might want to plant even more heavily than this just to make sure you get a good germ rate. So that's all there was to it for these onions. It took just a few minutes, and I probably have like 500 onion seeds here, which is crazy. and they don't even take up very much of this tray. They take up like maybe a quarter or a third of this tray, which is so incredible that you can start so much food in such a small space. That's one reason that I love growing onions from seed, and I think I will always do that. And if each of these cells grows like 40 or 50 onions, if you do the math, that's like 400 to 500 onions. So I am really looking forward to seeing how that's gonna do this year. So let's move on to the next seed. I'm going to be sowing this lemongrass in these 2 pots in the corner here. On the back of this packet, it says that lemongrass typically has irregular germination and to sow thickly for best results. So last year I did sow these really thickly, but I found that I had incredible germination and my lemongrass patch was way too thick. So I'm gonna try and go a little bit lighter this time. And if you have watched our garden tours from 2021, the lemongrass I grew was an absolute beast. It took up like half of a raised garden bed and it was so beautiful. And by the end of the year, I harvested a ton of lemongrass and I made up a bunch of red curry paste and green curry paste, and then I also just diced some of it and I have a ton of it in the freezer right now. So for us, since we have really humid summers and it is a tropical plant, it just did really well in our climate. This year, now that I know that lemongrass can get so large, I'm actually going to be planting it in our front garden instead of in our vegetable garden, and I'm going to be using it more as a landscape plant. I'll still be able to harvest from it, but it's not going to take up lots of valuable space in my raised bed this year. Next up, I'm going to be starting the celery. For this one, it does need light to germinate, so I'm not going to cover these seeds up once I sow them. I'm just going to lightly press them onto the surface of the soil to make sure they have good contact. And here's what the seeds look like if you can see them. They kind of look like parsley or carrot seeds, but they are super tiny. So I think the best way to do this is to kind of just take my finger and like pick up a couple of the seeds with whatever moisture is on my finger, and then I can just dab it onto the surface of the soil. I tried growing these in the fall this past year, but they didn't do so well, so I'm trying to grow a good amount in the spring, and then if I have excess, then I can always just dice them and put them in the freezer, and that way I can have them on hand for soups and stocks. So I probably did too many in each of these just because it's really hard to see them since they're so small, but I can always just thin it out later. And I'm just gonna try and press them in. And lastly, we're going to be starting the thyme, and I'm gonna sow these kind of thick because I want it to be like a nice hardy bush of thyme instead of just like one scrawny little plant. And these seeds are also really tiny, so I'm gonna try and cover them as lightly as possible. Another good thing to use for really tiny seeds is vermiculite. You can just put that over the surface because the seeds are still able to get light through the vermiculite, but it helps it to stay a little bit more moist. Here are all of our finished pots, and it doesn't even fill a whole tray. So there's plenty of space for more things to start in the next few weeks and months. And if all goes well, these little tiny pots are going to have lots of plants in them for us to grow this year in the garden. I'm going to set this up inside on a seed starting rack that we have equipped with grow lights, and I'm also going to be covering these with a humidity dome until most of the seeds come up, and they're going to stay inside until about mid-March. So I'll keep you guys updated on how those grow, and soon enough we're going to be starting lots of other things as well. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next one.